The courtroom was quiet except for the rustling of papers and the soft shuffle of shoes against the cold marble floor as the woman stepped forward, her heels clicking sharply with each step, her eyes scanning the room as she made her way to the front, the judge's gaze already fixed on her. She wore a simple dark coat and black trousers, her demeanor calm, but something about her seemed different. She didn't seem nervous, not the slightest hint of unease in her posture. It was almost as if she had been here before many times, and this was just another day, another case to move through. The judge, an older man with graying hair and a stern face, was known for his no-nonsense approach. His reputation for fairness had often been praised, but so had his harshness in sentencing. No one ever left his court feeling lenient or generous. He was a man who believed in order and discipline, and when people broke the law, they paid for it, no questions asked. The woman stood in front of him, now her hands resting calmly at her sides, her back straight, and her eyes unwaveringly locked on his face. The judge looked at her over his glasses, his sharp eyes assessing her every movement. He had already read through the details of her case, a minor traffic violation, no big deal, he thought, and yet something about her presence struck him with a strange sense of familiarity. It wasn't the first time he had seen her face, he couldn't place it, but the feeling gnawed at him as he shifted his weight slightly and cleared his throat, preparing to issue the verdict. The room was still filled with the low murmur of the spectators in the back, the occasional cough, or the creaking of a chair. The tension in the air was palpable as the judge adjusted his glasses and began to speak, his voice deep and firm. It echoed slightly off the walls as he began reading out her sentence for the traffic violation. The fine was to be significant, not overly excessive, but enough to make a point, a small but noticeable amount that would be felt a penalty for breaking the law, nothing more, nothing less. He didn't expect her to react. She was, after all, just one of many people who walked through these doors every day. There were always people with excuses, or those who tried to explain themselves, but the woman didn't flinch. She didn't blink. Her eyes didn't waver from his. They remained steady and unyielding as he spoke, as though she had heard it all before, and the words had no power over her. The judge finished reading the verdict and waited for a reaction, yet nothing came. She didn't seem surprised. She didn't seem upset. There was no anger or frustration, no pleading or bargaining. She simply stood there as though it was the most natural thing in the world, as though she was meant to be standing in front of him in this very moment, in this very place. For a brief moment, he hesitated, his mind racing, trying to place her face, trying to remember where he had seen her before. The silence in the courtroom stretched on for what felt like an eternity. The audience looked at each other in confusion. What was going on? Why wasn't she reacting? Was she okay? Had she heard him clearly? Was she even paying attention? And yet the woman stood there, unmoved, calm, serene, and completely unbothered by the words that had just been spoken. She was a mystery to everyone in the room. And as the judge looked at her, the feeling that he knew her only grew stronger, but it still eluded him. The woman's stillness was both a challenge and a puzzle, her quiet strength making it impossible for him to simply move on with the proceedings as though this was just another case. He had to know more. He had to understand who she was and why she wasn't like everyone else who had walked through his court. The room seemed to hold its breath, waiting for something to break the silence. But no one spoke, not yet. There was a question in the air, one that would hang over the entire case. What was it about this woman that made her so different from all the others? What was it about her presence that made everything feel heavier? The judge cleared his throat again, this time louder, as if trying to shake the strange feeling that had settled over him. The room remained still and quiet as he glanced down at the case file in front of him, trying to focus on the words on the paper. But his mind kept drifting back to the woman standing before him, the way she stood there, unflinching, unmoved by his decision, as if she had already known what was coming, as if this moment held no weight for her. But for everyone else in the room, it was all they could focus on. The fine he had imposed seemed too small for such a charged atmosphere. Something was wrong, but no one could put their finger on it. The judge rubbed his chin thoughtfully, the weight of the silence pressing on him. The fine he had just handed down was supposed to be simple, a penalty for breaking the law, nothing more. But this woman had made it feel like so much more than that. It had become something personal, something that made the judge question the fairness of his decision, something that made him uncomfortable, even though he had done what he always did when someone broke the law, issued the fine and moved on. The woman finally moved just slightly. Her hand reached into her coat pocket, and she pulled out a piece of paper, slowly folding it in her hands as though preparing for something. The crowd began to stir restlessly, watching her with growing curiosity. What was she doing? Why was she acting so differently from everyone else? This wasn't how people responded to fines. Most pleaded or protested or tried to justify their actions, but she was doing nothing of the sort. The judge's gaze narrowed as she continued to hold the paper, her fingers curling around it, until he could see her knuckles turn white. She didn't look at the paper. Instead, she stared straight ahead, her gaze locked onto his. It was as though they were engaged in some silent conversation, some unspoken exchange of power that only they could understand, and that made him uneasy. Without warning, she spoke, her voice calm and steady, but with an underlying strength that immediately drew everyone's attention. "Your Honor," she said, her tone even but carrying a weight that none of them had expected. "I don't believe this fine is justified." There was no anger, no accusation in her voice, but the words hung in the air like a challenge. The judge blinked. He wasn't used to being spoken to like this, not in his court, not like this. She had not only accepted his ruling, but now she was questioning it. It was an unprecedented move, one that made the judge feel a sudden wave of frustration well up inside him. He had already made his decision. Why was she challenging it now? What was she trying to prove? Was she trying to undermine his authority? Was she testing him? Was she going to make this harder than it needed to be? He opened his mouth to speak, but before he could, she spoke again, with a slight edge to her voice that caught him off guard. "I understand the importance of upholding the law," she continued, "but I also believe that there are circumstances in which the law should be questioned, where the spirit of justice should take precedence over blind adherence to a rulebook, and in my case today, the spirit of justice has not been served." Her words felt like a direct blow to the foundation of everything the judge believed in. They weren't just an argument, they were a challenge to his very role as a judge, to his authority, to the decisions he had made over the years, to his belief in the unassailable power of the law. He could feel the eyes of the room on him as his pulse quickened, his fingers gripping the sides of the bench as he looked at the woman before him. She was no ordinary defendant. She was something more, something that he had not yet figured out, but he would soon have to confront. The room fell into an uncomfortable silence once more, and the judge felt his confidence faltering for the first time in many years. He didn't know whether to continue with his original ruling, or to somehow acknowledge the depth of her words. How was it that this woman, who seemed so ordinary, had become the center of his attention in a way no one else had? As he looked at her, it hit him once more. This woman had a power over him, a presence that made him question not only his decision, but the very essence of what it meant to uphold the law, what it meant to be fair and just, and whether that was always as simple as it seemed. The judge took a deep breath, trying to steady himself, his mind racing as he processed what had just happened. He was no longer in control of the situation. He was no longer the unquestioned authority in the room, and that realization unsettled him more than he cared to admit. He had been in courtrooms for decades, seen countless defendants plead their cases, seen lawyers argue with passion, and yet never had anyone made him feel so unmoored, so uncertain of his own convictions. He glanced down at the paper in front of him, his hands trembling slightly as he reached for the gavel. It felt almost symbolic, as if by striking it, he would somehow reclaim control over the room. But something inside him told him not to, not yet. There was more to this moment than simply finishing the case. He had to understand her. He had to understand what this woman wanted from him, and why her calm in the face of his authority felt like an invitation to something bigger. The woman stood motionless, waiting for his response, her face unreadable, yet there was something in her eyes, something that spoke of a depth he couldn't grasp, something that made him feel as though he was looking into a mirror, not at a person, but at a reflection of his own doubts, his own insecurities, his own fears. It was disorienting, and made him question everything he thought he knew about his role as a judge. Her stillness only added to the tension in the room. The audience was now silent, all eyes fixed on the exchange between the judge and the woman. No one dared to speak, no one dared to breathe too loudly, as though any sound might shatter the fragile web of tension that had enveloped the courtroom. The judge cleared his throat again, louder this time, but his voice cracked slightly, betraying his unease. As he finally spoke, "I appreciate your perspective." He said his words slow and measured, but they felt hollow to him. They felt like an attempt to regain some semblance of control over a situation that had already slipped out of his hands. But he pressed on. This is a court of law, and the law is meant to be followed regardless of personal beliefs. He continued, trying to assert his authority, but there was a lack of conviction in his tone, a gap between what he said and what he felt. The woman didn't flinch, she didn't react at all to his words, she simply stared at him with the same intensity as before. Her silence spoke volumes, louder than any argument could have ever done, and in that silence the judge felt a creeping sense of doubt worm its way into his mind. Was she right? Was he simply upholding a system that didn't always serve justice? Was the law truly fair? Or was it a tool used to maintain power, to keep people in line, and to punish those who dared to question it? He swallowed hard, trying to push those thoughts away, but they lingered like a shadow hanging over him. He had always believed in the law, he had always believed in the certainty of rules and procedures. They were clear, they were reliable, and they gave him a sense of purpose. But now, standing before this woman with her unyielding gaze, he felt the walls of that certainty beginning to crack. The woman's voice cut through the silence once more, but this time it was softer, almost like a whisper, but still strong enough to reach him. "Your Honor," she said, "I know you believe in the law, but I also know that you've seen its flaws. You've seen how it fails the very people it was meant to protect, and you've seen how it punishes the innocent while rewarding those who hold power." The judge recoiled slightly at her words, the weight of them settling on his chest like a stone. She was speaking truths that he had tried to ignore, truths that he had known deep down, but had never dared to confront. But she had confronted them head-on without fear, and now he was left to face them too. Her words weren't just an accusation, they were a mirror to his own conscience, forcing him to acknowledge the uncomfortable reality that he was a part of a system that sometimes failed to live up to its ideals. And in that moment he realized that he wasn't just judging her, he was judging himself too. The judge felt an unfamiliar weight in his chest as the woman's words settled into his thoughts. They weren't just words, they were a challenge to everything he had believed about himself and the system he had dedicated his life to. It was as though she had stripped away the armor he had built around himself over the years. The conviction he had once felt in the righteousness of his position was now slipping through his fingers like sand. His mind was spinning, trying to grasp hold of the familiar, but everything was turning into something else. He couldn't look away from her eyes, those eyes that seemed to see right through him, as though she could peer into the very depths of his soul and understand his doubts, understand his weaknesses, as if she knew exactly where to strike and what would make him falter. He felt exposed in a way he never had before, not in his years of ruling over countless cases of justice and punishment, not in the midst of his steady and calculated decisions. Nothing had ever made him feel this raw, this vulnerable, this small. The woman stood there, still unwavering, still unshaken by his discomfort. Her silence was a quiet power, a power that made the courtroom hold its breath, as if waiting for the next step, waiting for the judge to respond to her challenge. But he couldn't find the words. He didn't know how to respond to her, not in a way that would satisfy the unspoken questions rising within him. He had always been in control, he had always been the one to decide the fate of others. But now it felt like he was the one who was being judged. The audience shifted in their seats, the tension growing as the judge fought to regain his composure. His fingers tightened around the gavel, once more his knuckles turning white. He could feel the pressure of the room's eyes on him, but it wasn't the spectators that made him uneasy. It was her steady gaze that pierced through him and made him question everything he thought he knew about justice, about the law, and about his own place within it. The judge took another breath, his chest rising and falling rapidly. As he tried to steady his racing thoughts, he knew he had to say something. He had to regain control of the situation. But the words wouldn't come. He wanted to dismiss her words as mere defiance, to move on and finish the case. But he couldn't bring himself to do it. He couldn't ignore what she had said because deep down he knew she was right. He had seen the flaws in the system. He had seen the powerlessness of the poor and the oppressed who had walked through his courtroom only to be crushed under the weight of the very laws he upheld. And for the first time in years he wasn't sure if the law was always right, or if it even always served justice. "Your Honor," she said, breaking the silence again, her voice gentle, but still carrying that unmistakable weight. "I know you're a man of integrity. I know you've tried to do what's right, I can see that, but you're also a man of the system. And the system isn't always kind." She paused, as if choosing her words carefully, but the power of her voice didn't diminish for a moment. "I've been a part of that system. I've seen it fail over and over again. But you have the chance to change it even in small ways today. You have the chance to see beyond the rules and understand the bigger picture." Her words hung in the air between them, and for a long moment the judge didn't speak. He didn't move. He just stood there frozen, caught in the moment, where his identity as a judge collided with his identity as a human being. He had spent years placing his faith in the idea that the law could always be trusted, that justice could always be served through its framework. But now the cracks were appearing before his very eyes, and he couldn't pretend they weren't there. He wanted to respond with the usual dismissive words, the usual justification for his decisions, but he couldn't. He could feel the weight of her gaze upon him, and he knew that this time the words wouldn't come so easily. He had to say something, but what could he say to this woman who had so effortlessly unraveled everything he had held dear, who had made him question not only the case before him, but the very foundation of his own beliefs? The judge's mind was spinning, his hands shaking slightly as he looked down at the case file in front of him. But the paper felt foreign now. It felt meaningless in this moment, as if it were no longer the truth of the situation. He had to look beyond it to see what this moment truly meant, what it meant for him, what it meant for her, what it meant for the very idea of justice. The judge looked at the woman before him, her eyes unwavering and deep, as though they were pulling him into a place he had never dared to go, a place where the line between right and wrong was not so clear, where the laws he had sworn to uphold were suddenly not enough to justify the weight of every decision he had made in this very room, the weight of every person he had sentenced, the weight of the system he had served for so long. For the first time in his life, the judge felt the full weight of his position. He had spent years in the courtroom making decisions that had affected the lives of so many people, but now in this moment he realized that those decisions were not just numbers on a piece of paper. They were lives. They were real people who had walked into his court hoping for justice, and he had delivered whatever he thought was fair without ever truly understanding the consequences of his actions. The woman stood in front of him, as if she knew all of this, as if she had seen this moment coming from the very beginning, and knew exactly how to make him question everything he had built his career on. He felt small in her presence. He felt as though everything he had believed in was crumbling around him, and he didn't know how to stop it, or if he even should. "I've seen the way you've ruled," she said quietly, her voice soft but firm. "But I've also seen the way you've changed. You may not realize it yet, but you've grown into someone who understands the importance of mercy as much as you understand the importance of justice. I've seen that in your decisions, even when you didn't want to admit it." The judge blinked, unsure of what she meant, at first unsure of how to take her words. Was she praising him? Was she mocking him? Did she truly see him as someone who had changed? Or was she simply playing some kind of game with him, trying to confuse him into second-guessing every move he made? But the more he thought about it, the more he realized she was right. He had changed. He had spent years ruling over cases where he handed out sentences without a second thought, without truly considering the lives. He was affecting the people behind the charges, but somewhere along the way he had begun to see things differently. He had begun to understand that the law was not always perfect, that there were flaws in the system that he had been blind to for so long. She wasn't just a defendant before him. Now she was a mirror reflecting back the judge's own evolution, his own awakening to the deeper meaning of justice and fairness. She had made him question the very foundation of his role as a judge, and for the first time he was beginning to see the cracks in the system he had spent his life serving. But the woman wasn't done yet. She stepped forward just slightly, her presence still strong, her words still clear. "I know what you've been through," she said, not in a way that was accusatory, but as if she had lived it herself. "I know what it feels like to be caught in a system that doesn't always have your best interests at heart. I know what it feels like to be told you don't matter, to be silenced by the very rules that are meant to protect you, and I know that you've seen that too." The judge felt a chill run down his spine. Her words were too close to his own fears to ignore, too close to his own guilt to dismiss. And yet he had never thought of himself as someone who was trapped by the system. He had always thought of himself as someone who wielded power over it, someone who had the authority to make the system work for the people. But now he realized that in his pursuit of order he had lost sight of the human element of justice. He had lost sight of the very thing that had made him want to become a judge in the first place. For the first time in years, the judge questioned whether he was on the right side of the law, whether he had truly served justice, or merely perpetuated a cycle of power that had done more harm than good. He had always believed that his decisions were right, that the law was black and white. But now he realized that the world wasn't so simple. The world was messy and complicated, and filled with people who were not just numbers or defendants, but real lives that deserved to be treated with dignity. The woman was still standing there, waiting patiently, as if she knew he needed time, as if she had already won the battle, not with words, but with the simple act of making him see what he had failed to see all these years. The judge stood frozen, his mind racing as the woman's words echoed in his ears. The courtroom was silent now. Even the faint sounds of shuffling and murmuring had ceased as all eyes remained fixed on the exchange between the two of them. He could feel the weight of the room bearing down on him like never before. It was as if the entire world had come to a standstill, all of it focused on him in this moment. And yet he still couldn't move, he couldn't speak. The woman's presence was too strong, too overwhelming, and he could not escape it. What did it mean to be a judge? What did it mean to serve justice? Had he truly been doing so all these years? Or had he been serving something else, something that had more to do with upholding power than with fairness? Was he just another cog in a machine that was broken beyond repair? He had believed in the system for so long, but now those beliefs felt fragile, like glass about to shatter with the slightest touch. The woman's gaze remained steady, unwavering, as she looked at him, not with anger or accusation, but with understanding. It was as if she could see right into his soul, and knew exactly what he was feeling, knew exactly what he was questioning, knew the doubts that had begun to seep into his mind and take root there. "I'm not here to make you feel guilty," she said softly, her voice carrying an undeniable strength despite its quietness. "I'm here to help you see the truth that we all need to stop pretending the system works the way it should and start seeing the people behind the cases, the stories behind the charges, the lives that are affected by every decision we make." Her words struck him harder than anything he had ever heard before. They weren't just words, they were a call to action. They were a plea for him to wake up to the reality that he had spent years ignoring, and for the first time, he felt the truth of it all sink deep into his bones. He had spent so much time focused on the rules and procedures that he had forgotten to see the faces of the people in front of him, the human beings who were affected by every ruling he handed down. What had he been doing all this time? He had been so focused on being right, on maintaining the power of his position, that he had lost sight of the very thing that mattered the most, the people in front of him, the very people who were supposed to be the reason he was there in the first place. The woman's voice broke through his thoughts once more, but this time it was softer, almost as though she was speaking to him and to everyone else in the room at the same time. "We can't fix the system all at once," she said, "but we can start by acknowledging the truth. We can start by seeing the people we've been ignoring. We can start by giving them the respect and dignity they deserve. And maybe, just maybe, that will begin to change everything." Her words were simple, but they carried so much weight, so much truth. He could feel the floodgates opening inside of him. He had never truly understood the depth of his role until this very moment, and now it was like he was seeing everything for the first time. The judge felt his throat tighten. He was struggling to breathe. It felt like something inside of him was breaking apart. He wanted to speak, but the words were stuck. He wanted to say something to show that he understood, that he was beginning to understand, but the weight of it all was too much to put into words. For a long moment he stood there in silence, unable to speak, unable to move, and yet in that silence something shifted, something changed deep within him, and he knew that he would never be the same again. He had been confronted with a truth so raw, so undeniable, that he couldn't turn away from it, no matter how hard he tried. As the silence stretched on, he realized that the woman had already done what she came to do. She had planted the seed of change within him, and now it was up to him to decide what to do with it. It was up to him to decide whether he would continue down the path he had always walked, or whether he would choose a new path, one where justice truly meant something more than just following the law. The room remained still, the weight of the moment hanging in the air, and the judge stood there wondering what the next step would be, what the consequences of this moment would be, and whether he was truly ready to face them. The judge finally took a breath, his chest rising and falling with the weight of the decision he knew he had to make, but was still unsure of how to proceed. He had always prided himself on his ability to remain detached, to not let emotions cloud his judgment. But now everything was different. Every rule he had followed felt like it was crumbling before him, and the pressure to make the right choice had never been greater. He looked at the woman again, and for the first time he saw something more than just a defendant in her eyes. He saw a person who had lived through things he could never fully understand, but who also understood the system better than anyone else in this room. He saw someone who had been failed by the very system he had sworn to uphold, and yet still had the strength to stand before him with a sense of purpose and dignity. It was then that the judge realized just how much he had been missing. He had spent his career looking at people as cases, numbers to be processed and ruled upon, but he had never really seen them. He had never seen the full picture of their lives, the struggles that brought them to his courtroom, or the consequences of his decisions on the lives they were trying to rebuild. The woman's gaze never faltered. She was still waiting for him to make a decision. But now it wasn't about the fine or the penalty. It was about something much deeper, something that was far more important than the legalities of the case. It was about justice in its truest sense, about the responsibility he held as a judge to not only follow the law, but to see the truth beyond it, to understand when the law was not enough, and when human compassion needed to take precedence. His hand gripped the edge of the bench, once more his mind racing as he thought back on all the cases he had ruled, on all the people he had sentenced over the years, and how many of them had left his courtroom only to fall through the cracks of a system that didn't always work in their favor. How many had been pushed aside, ignored, simply because they didn't have the resources or the privilege to fight for themselves. How many had been treated as if their lives didn't matter because they weren't part of the system's ideal and fair version of justice. He had always believed that the law was black and white, that his role as a judge was clear and unquestionable. But now he understood how much he had been blind to, how much of the world was gray, how much of the world needed more than just a rigid application of rules to be fair, how much of the world needed empathy, understanding, and a willingness to listen to the stories of those who felt unheard. The judge's throat felt tight, and he swallowed hard, his eyes never leaving the woman before him. She had done something he hadn't expected. She had shown him a side of himself he had been too afraid to confront. She had shown him that the system wasn't perfect, and neither was he, but that didn't mean there wasn't a chance for something better. "You're right," he finally said, his voice rough but steady. "You're right. I've spent too long thinking that I knew what was best. I've spent too long hiding behind the law and ignoring the people who are affected by it. I've spent too long pretending that following the rules was enough to bring about true justice." He paused as the words hung in the air, his mind still racing, but now with a sense of clarity that had been missing before. He could feel the shift within himself, a shift that had been coming for some time, but had finally found its voice, thanks to her, thanks to the courage she had shown in standing before him and challenging everything he had taken for granted. "This system isn't perfect," he continued, "and I can't pretend that it always serves the right people in the right way. But that doesn't mean we can't try to make it better. That doesn't mean I can't do better." He looked around the room for the first time since the trial began, and saw the faces of the people who had been watching him. They were waiting for him to make a decision. They were waiting for him to show them what kind of judge he was going to be, what kind of person he was going to be. And he realized that this moment was about more than just one case. It was about setting an example. It was about showing that change was possible, that justice could mean more than just following the rules, that it could be about understanding, seeing people for who they truly were, and making decisions that honored their humanity. The judge took a deep breath and finally made his decision. He looked at the woman and nodded, and then spoke the words that would change everything for him and for everyone who had been watching. The judge took a moment to gather his thoughts, his heart still pounding in his chest. As he looked down at the woman before him, he knew this decision would define him. He knew that whatever came next would be the result of a choice that was not based on precedent or law, but on something deeper, something more personal, and perhaps more important than the rigid framework he had spent his life upholding. He glanced at the rest of the courtroom, the faces of the spectators, and the lawyers, all waiting for his next move, all waiting to see what kind of judge he would be in this moment. And he realized that his decision would not just affect this case. It would send a message to everyone who walked through his doors from now on. It would show them that justice was not just about punishment. It was about understanding. It was about the people behind the laws and the rules. It was about treating everyone with the dignity and respect they deserved. The silence in the room grew heavier as the judge stood there looking at the woman who had brought him to this moment. He could feel her gaze still on him, still waiting patiently for him to speak. But it wasn't just her gaze now. It was the weight of the moment, the weight of all the people who had ever walked through his courtroom, who had ever been affected by his decisions, who had ever wondered if they were truly seen, if they were truly understood. He could feel the turning point inside of him. He could feel himself on the edge of something new, a shift in his perspective that he knew would alter the course of his career and his life. But it was also something he had to embrace. He had to embrace the uncertainty, the vulnerability, the unknown of stepping away from what he had always believed to be true. And so the judge spoke, his voice firm, but softer than usual. The words felt different in his mouth as he let them out. "I'm going to reduce your fine," he said, looking at the woman directly, "and I'm going to offer you an opportunity to pay it in a way that gives back to the community, in a way that benefits others." The room seemed to hold its breath for a moment, and then murmurs started to ripple through the audience. But the judge didn't care about the whispers. He didn't care about how the decision might be received by the public or by his colleagues. He had made the choice not out of fear, but out of a sense of responsibility to do what he knew was right, to do what he could to begin to repair the system he had once believed was beyond repair. He looked at the woman again and saw something shift in her expression. There was no surprise, no outrage, no demand for more. There was just quiet acceptance, as if she had known all along that this was where it would lead, that this was the moment where the law and humanity would intersect. The judge paused for a moment, letting the gravity of his words settle in. And then he continued, "But I also want you to know that this isn't about me or about your case. This is about all of us," he said, looking at the room as a whole. "This is about understanding that we are all part of the system, and that sometimes the system doesn't serve everyone equally. Sometimes the system needs to be held accountable too, and we need to start asking ourselves what kind of system we want to be part of." He knew his words were risky. He knew they might make people uncomfortable, but he also knew they were necessary. He couldn't continue to walk through life pretending that everything was fine, pretending that the law was always just, pretending that the system was perfect. He had seen enough to know that it wasn't, and that his role as a judge was not just about following the rules, but about making the system better by acknowledging its flaws. The woman nodded slightly, her expression unreadable, but there was a sense of gratitude in her eyes, a quiet understanding that passed between them, as if they both knew that this moment was more than just a courtroom decision. It was a turning point for both of them. The judge looked around the room one last time and felt something inside of him settle. He had made the right decision, not just for the woman before him, but for himself as well. For the first time in years, he felt like he had truly understood what justice was. He felt like he had done something that mattered, something that could make a difference, not just in one case, but in the very system he had been a part of for so long. As the woman left the courtroom, the judge remained standing for a moment longer, his mind still racing. but now with a sense of purpose. He knew that the work ahead of him would be difficult, but it was also necessary. He knew that he couldn't change everything overnight, but he had taken the first step, and for the first time in a long time, he believed that change was possible.